in the small, mountain-locked town of Weir, on the outskirts of which stood an old psychiatric hospital hidden deep within a dense forest, strange events began to unfold. The locals always avoided this place, considering it cursed, but no one could say exactly why. The legends passed down through generations were so contradictory that the true story had long been forgotten. Some said that the hospital treated the most dangerous patients, others claimed that gruesome experiments were conducted there, and still others spoke of a mysterious fire that destroyed the building to its foundations. Mikhail was a young photographer who had come to the town to work on a project about abandoned places. He specialized in photographing ruins, forgotten and forsaken locations that had once been full of life. Intrigued by the local rumors, he decided to visit the hospital. The locals tried to dissuade him, but he was drawn by the mystery and the desire to uncover something new. The road to the hospital was long and perilous. The thick forest, overgrown with thorny bushes, almost obscured the path, which seemed long unused. That day, the sun barely showed itself behind thick gray clouds, forcing Mikhail to walk in semi-darkness, which made the forest even more menacing. The forest seemed alive, its silence oppressive, and every rustle of leaves or crack of branches made Mikhail's heart skip a beat. When he finally reached the hospital, a grim structure loomed before him, peeling and half-ruined, yet still intimidating. The large arched windows were shattered. The roof had collapsed in several places, but traces of former grandeur remained. The inscription above the entrance, barely discernible due to time and weather, read St. Clara's Sanatorium. Upon entering, Mikhail immediately felt an inexplicable anxiety. The hall was covered in a layer of dust. There were no signs of human or animal presence. It seemed that time had stopped in this place. The photographer took out his camera and began to shoot, trying to capture every corner, every cracked brick. But the further he ventured into the building, the more he felt that someone was watching him. The corridors were long and dark, the walls covered in mold and peeling paint. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. In one of the corridors, Mikhail noticed strange marks scratched into the walls. They didn't resemble anything he knew, seeming to be some ancient symbols. He took several photos but felt increasingly uneasy with every step. On the building's second floor, Mikhail found an old operating room. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the operating table stood as if it had been recently used. Rusty tools lay on metal trays, and the walls were speckled with black stains. Mikhail looked closer and realized these were bloodstains, long dried but still visible. His attention was drawn to an old medical file lying on the floor. He picked it up and, flipping through, found records of a patient named Alina. According to the notes, she was a patient with a severe mental disorder, suffering from hallucinations and paranoia. However, the last entry stated that she was suddenly discharged without explanation. This struck Mikhail as odd, but he decided not to dwell on it. As he descended back to the first floor, he heard a faint rustling sound coming from deep within the corridor. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sound repeated. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps. Mikhail decided to follow the sound, thinking that perhaps some animal had gotten into the building. But the further he walked, the stranger the sound became. It seemed that the footsteps were approaching, but the source remained invisible. Suddenly, the corridor ahead of him narrowed sharply, and the walls began to close in on him from all sides. Mikhail felt panic rising and, without thinking, ran back, but the corridor he had entered was gone. Now he found himself in a maze, the walls of which were covered in the same strange symbols he had seen earlier. The light from his flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead, and he began to feel that someone was watching him. He couldn't understand what was happening or how he had ended up in this maze. The space around him began to distort. The walls seemed alive, shifting and changing position. Suddenly, he heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, whispering his name. Mikhail froze, unable to understand where the sound was coming from. Panicking, he looked around, trying to find a way out, but the corridor kept changing, as if leading him to a specific place. At the end of one corridor, he saw a door, the only one in this cursed place. Running up to it, Mikhail tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. A rusty lock hung on the door, and beside it on the wall was another symbol, more complex and sinister. Mikhail began to lose control, but suddenly the lock fell off by itself. The door slowly creaked open. He entered and found himself in a small room, dimly lit. In the center of the room stood a round table, on which lay an old photo album. Around the table were several armchairs, and the walls were covered in mirrors. Mikhail approached the album and opened it. The pages were filled with black and white photographs. The first few showed patients of the hospital, but as he turned the pages, the photographs became stranger. Shadows, dark silhouettes began to appear in the photos, observing the patients. At the end of the album, he found a photograph of himself, taken the moment he had entered the building. Terrified, Mikhail threw the album aside and, turning around, saw that the mirrors were beginning to darken. In the reflection, he noticed that someone was standing behind him. It was a woman with a pale face and hollow eyes. He recognized her. It was Alina, the patient he had read about. She started to move toward him, but Mikhail couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, everything around him began to spin, and he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he found himself in the same place where he had started, but now everything was different. The building no longer appeared ruined, and what's more, there were sounds, footsteps, conversations, the sounds of nurses hurrying down the corridors. Mikhail tried to leave, but the door through which he had entered was no longer there. Around him were living people, patients, but none of them noticed him, as if he were invisible. Having completely lost his mind, Mikhail realized that he had become a part of this place, that he had been taken. He had become yet another ghost, trapped within these walls forever.